Okay, everyone, we're taking a break from prejudicial versus probative and Rule 403 and moving on into a couple of the more in-depth character evidence rules. First up is habit or routine practice, Rule 406. Let me just pull that up. Oh, need to be screen 2. And there we are. Okay. So, evidence of a person's habit or an organization's routine practice may be admitted to prove that on a particular occasion, the person or organization acted in accordance with the habit or routine practice. The court may admit this evidence regardless of whether it is corroborated or whether there was an eyewitness. Now, this seems pretty intuitive, right? If someone does something habitually or an organization does something routinely, then even if there is no direct evidence supporting that it occurred in the given instance, it can still be admissible if it helps prove something. An example would be if you could establish a habit of waking up at 8 a.m. and brushing your teeth, leaving for work at 9. Let's say you got that morning routine and you had so much evidence that it could be described as a habit. That evidence could be useful to say, well, if the murder happened at 8:15, it's very unlikely that this person did it because they habitually do something at that same time. That's perhaps an example of using habit. Or routine practice can be the same thing. Let's say there's a board meeting every Friday at 1 o'clock. Even if you don't have any direct evidence that board meeting happened, if you have years and years of data that the board meeting happened, then you can kind of assume that the board meeting happened on that day, and maybe that absolves people of liability or gives people some aid when it comes to establishing an alibi. Something important about habit or routine practice, and people don't get this. One, it doesn't come up very often. It seems understandable. It seems like it might, but it really doesn't, because habits and routine practices are incredibly difficult to lay foundation for. For something to be deemed habitual by the courts or to be a routine practice, if it's an organization you're talking about, it has to be done automatically without any sort of impetus on a consistent basis. And by consistent, it's not just like every week. It has to be done with a high degree of regularity, to the point that it would almost be, if you're trying to use habit evidence to absolve someone of liability in a given case, so like you're trying to use the habit as an alibi, then the habit has to be strong enough that the absence of the habit would be evidence to the contrary. So like, let's say you have evidence that the guy habitually brushes his teeth and goes to work, between 8 and 9 o'clock, and you have direct evidence that that was not the case on a given day. If the habit is strong enough to be used in his favor, if he was in fact brushing his teeth that day, then it has to be strong enough to be used as evidence against him if that's not the case. And the only way it can be strong enough evidence against him is if it's incredibly routine. There's a lot of foundation that has to go into establishing something as habitual. If someone tries to use habit or routine practice on you, the typical best way to respond is, Your Honor, there hasn't been sufficient foundation laid that this is habitual. The fact that it happened occasionally, the fact that it even happened regularly, but only in response to some other stimulus, isn't enough. To be habitual, it has to be almost an automatic thing that is almost out of the person's control at that point. It's a very high standard. It's a very high burden that people in mock trial don't quite understand because the rule doesn't explicitly entail it. And hopefully for that last sentence, it kind of just makes sense that habit or routine practice evidence doesn't need independent corroboration to be admitted. Obviously, though, that independent corroboration would make it stronger, but it doesn't need it to be admitted because the evidence of the habit is so strong and so compelling that you can assume it occurred because it was habitual, even if there's no direct evidence supporting that. That's habit or routine practice. Hopefully it's clear how that ties into character evidence and propensity. It's beyond propensity. So just because I was violent, I'm not saying that you can make a habit out of being violent, but like I was violent a couple times isn't evidence to prove that I'm violent today. But if I'm violent every day at 5 o'clock because the bell rings and like I just have the same exact outburst because the bell is ringing at school or something, then perhaps that could be exhibited to prove habit under that rationale. That's habit or routine practice. That's rule 406. Just be careful, particularly when it comes to the foundation of that rule. We're going to move on to 407 next, guys. See ya.